Good morning, everybody. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm Director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and this morning's webinar is being hosted by us at HEPI. We're celebrating our 20th birthday this week, hence the logo behind me, and Unite Students, who are the UK's biggest student accommodation provider. And they've been running an applicant survey for a number of years, which I personally think is a very valuable resource and initiative, because we survey students so very heavily, including us ourselves at HEPI with Advance HE in our Student Academic Experience Survey. But we don't perhaps know as much as we might do about people who are on the pathway to higher education, but haven't yet got there, and what their expectations and fears and experiences are. And that, of course, is critically important always, but especially perhaps during the recent times we've been living in with COVID and all the other upheavals. So we've got a very strong panel this morning. First, we're going to hear from Jenny Shaw, who's Higher Education External Engagement Director at Unite Students and has been working in the sector for a long time, and I know passionately cares about the quality of the student experience. And I've had many conversations with her over the years about these issues. And Jenny will present the findings of this year's index. And we're then going to turn to a panel. And the first person we're going to hear from is Nona McDuff, OBE, who's a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Student Engagement at London Metropolitan University and an expert on race and racism in the higher education sector, and has also had a lot of experience working at other universities such as Kingston and Solent. After Nona, we're going to hear from Laura McInerney. Now, Laura comes to education primarily from a schools and teaching background. She was a teacher, and then she was editor of Schools Week, and she now founded and runs Teacher Tap, which is an amazing resource which tells us what teachers really feel and experience, and had a wonderful, for example, thread on Laura's Twitter feed the other day about what participants in Teacher Tap had said about the most moving and interesting and rewarding gifts they'd received from children at the end of the academic year. It's very moving, and I draw your attention to it. Laura is also the person behind, it doesn't quite, there we are, a top Trump style game on former secretaries of state for education, which is great fun. I got it for Christmas. And then after Laura, we're going to hear from Sam Bronheim. Sam is an elected officer of Manchester University Students' Union, so sits, for example, on the University of Manchester board as part of that, and has a degree in zoology. So, has been living the student life and can tell us absolutely what the students at one of the very biggest universities in the country are feeling and have been experiencing. So it's all on the record. Please do put your questions in the chat, or the Q&A function rather, down the bottom, because we do want lots of questions to put to the panel. We'll ask you to put your own questions, if you're comfortable to do that, by turning your microphone on, not your camera, but your microphone, to put the question direct to the panelists. So do keep the questions coming in. It's all on the record. Thank you for being here. With no further ado, I'm going to turn to Jenny Shaw, who has some slides and is going to share her screen now.
Okay, let me just share that. Can you see my slides?
We can, Jenny.
That's wonderful. And are they full screen, Nick?
They are. It's looking
great.
Lovely.
That's good. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be here today and to share the results of the applicant index. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists as well, as to what they've taken from this. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to share, I can't possibly share everything that's in the report because it is quite vast, but I'll give you a bit of a taster. And I've just picked out a few data points that I think are particularly interesting at this present time, but very happy to take questions, and I will put the link to the full report as well in the chat when I've finished. So now, can I make my slides move? There we go. So the reason that we decided to create an index rather than just doing a survey is to give a visual picture of each applicant cohort on their journey towards university, and particularly to be able to compare them to previous cohorts. So this year is our second year, so it's the first time we've been able to do that comparison. So I'm just going to take you through very briefly what this has shown us. So these 9 themes draw from 40 different questions in the survey, and the full methodology is online. So in terms of finance, so this is primarily for financial confidence. Surprisingly, it has gone up a little this year. Now there's definitely a sense there that the shock of the cost of living crisis has a little bit worn off compared to last year when it was very new, and applicants are more confident in their skills to deal with it. So they're more confident in their budgeting skills. They're also feeling more confident about reaching out for financial help. But there are some caveats to that, as you might imagine. So I'll share that with you in a minute. In terms of their social confidence, that's gone up a little as well. They're much more confident about their relationships with family and friends, people at school or college, etc., which I guess we would expect as we leave the lockdowns and the pandemic behind. So that is also some good news. In terms of community, which is really about their orientation towards community, their desire for community, it is about the same. There have been a few changes in individual questions, but that's remained largely the same. Another surprise for me was that well-being has improved. And I will talk a little bit more about that. It is a finding that we're seeing with students as well. So it seems to be a very encouraging trend. In terms of their resilience, so this is primarily self-efficacy skills and ability to bounce back. That has improved as well. So this year they are notably more clear about their goals and where they're going than they were last year. The only one of our themes that has gone down is sustainability, and this is about their sustainable behaviours and also how important that they think it is. So this has gone down slightly. I have some additional data on that, which I think helps to explain it. In terms of their learning confidence, their confidence has gone up, which is very encouraging. Employment has stayed the same, so that's their employability and their confidence about their employability skills. And then finally, independence. So this is one that we introduced this year, so there's nothing to compare it with, but we were really interested to know how ready they were for living away from home, or if they're staying at home, just kind of doing things for themselves. And it was encouraging. The findings were very encouraging. They're generally quite confident, but again, some interesting findings when you start to break that down, which I will share with you. So that's just a very quick overview of this cohort. So I'll go into some additional stats here. So this is one that I think we might have expected, but is still, a bit of a pause for thought. So we ask, as we did last year, how much financial issues are affecting their mental health. So it's an agreement scale. And unsurprisingly, if you're from a more affluent household, the impact is less than if you're from a less affluent household. And it's quite a decent margin there. Also, as you might expect, if you don't have family support at all, if you are care experienced or if you're estranged, that is much higher. So these are the applicants, soon to be students, who may need some additional support there. So well-being. So we, as well as other questions, we do use the ONS standard well-being measures because it gives us a great opportunity to be able to compare that with the population as a whole, but I think probably more interestingly and importantly with students. The first thing to note there is that it has not got worse. So stopping the trend that we've seen over the last few years. So that is slightly encouraging. When it comes to anxiety, so the lowest levels of anxiety, that does seem to have improved. So it's just kind of on the edge of the margin of error. But I think given the findings from the HEPI Student Academic Experience Survey, which had a similar sort of uptick in terms of anxiety, then I think we can, you know, have a reasonable confidence that this is an actual thing, that anxiety is improving overall. But it's very small shoots, and you'll notice that compared to before the pandemic, and even compared to the middle of the pandemic, we're nowhere near where we were. Loneliness. Well, I think we've been talking about student loneliness for quite some time, and it is quite stubborn. It's not really shifted in that time. So it is just under a quarter of applicants who feel lonely all of the time or most of the time. But you'll see there's quite a range there of experiences of loneliness. What was really interesting is having the opportunity to compare it with student loneliness statistics from the HEPI Student Academic Experience Survey. So I'll show you what that looks like. So in terms of all applicants and students, the population level, it's not that different. So you can't really say that going to university makes applicants more or less lonely. It's very similar. But if you break that down into different demographics, there are a few groups that stand out in particular. So Black students, for example, tend to be more lonely at university than they are as applicants. The same with trans students, although they're starting from a much higher level of loneliness, and in the end, 50%, half of them are lonely as students. Within the LGBT plus demographic, so this is from the sexuality question rather than the gender identity question, loneliness doesn't appear to get any worse in particular. Now, given that that group will include some trans students, trans applicants as well, I think it's likely that there's going to be quite a wide range of experiences there. Some people going to university and really kind of finding their group and feeling, you know, sort of comfortable and part of a community, and those who are really feeling very isolated. Now, this is something that we have committed to research next year. So we'll be saying more about that later in the year. One slightly more positive piece of news is around students and applicants with a disability or health condition who do seem to get less lonely when they go to university. Now, this is predominantly, the majority of those have either got a mental health condition or are neurodivergent, and they do seem to become slightly less lonely at university, but still more lonely than average. So there's some interesting findings there. Here is a finding that it's a question we asked for the first time this year, and we weren't sure what we were going to find because although we know that there's quite a high level of absence in schools at the moment, we didn't know how much of it was directly due to mental health, and we didn't know how people at school and college were thinking about it themselves and how they would sort of characterize what was happening. But what we did find was 3 in 10 had missed education in the last 2 years due to their mental health. Now, when you apply that to the applicant population as a whole, so we've just applied it to those who are 19 or under, it's over 150,000 applicants who've missed education due to their mental health. For those who've had more substantial absence, so within that figure, it's about 1 in 14, which equates to just under 37,000 who've missed more than 4 weeks of school or college due to their mental health. Now, we don't know what this is going to mean when they come to university. We don't know if we're going to see more people taking breaks from their study, if it's going to be reflected in a higher or lower persistence rate. But that's, again, something to watch out for. And to be honest, we don't know if it's worse this year than it was last year because we didn't measure it in the past. But I thought that was a very interesting one. We talked about independence. Very interesting to see that applicants are confident in their practical skills. Now, I showed this data to the Cuba conference, so people who lead on student accommodation. There was a little bit of eye rolling at those first 3 bars, because although applicants seem to be very confident in their domestic skills, we don't always see them being applied in student accommodation. However, it's good to know they've got that confidence and they feel that they can do those things. However, when it comes to sort of the more interpersonal and self-care type of skills, much less confidence. So managing a conflict with a housemate, not very high level of confidence there, not very confident registering with a GP or dealing with a medical emergency. So opportunities there to provide information, support, learning, etc. It was also interesting to note that LGBT students were less confident about registering with a GP. I don't know why that is, but it would be interesting to see when we do the next piece of research. So another finding, we asked applicants if they thought they were going to be safe at university, and there were inequalities which were unsurprising, but still very disappointing to see. And they were along ethnicity lines. So if you are a Black applicant or an Asian applicant in particular, you are less likely to think that you're going to be safe at university. I think I won't say any more about that now, but just to sort of note that. But it is mirroring some of the findings that we had in our Living Black at University report. And then finally, I talked about climate change and how that the action and the attitude towards sustainability had decreased this year. And this could be part of the reason. They're not really convinced that their actions have an impact. And this is something that we've talked about. We've talked to universities about in the last week or so. As one of my colleagues says, our head of sustainability, he says actually, when they're at university, it's not just about the behaviours of that one student while at university, it's about the habits they get for life, and it's about the impact of all of the students on climate change. So I think there may be some opportunity here to really get some good communications to students about the impact of what they do, that actually it's bigger than they think, and if they all work together, they can actually make a difference. But I think it's also important to emphasize what we're all doing as well. So that's me. I think I've probably just slightly gone over time, Nick, apologies. But yes, happy to take any questions on that.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And I think we'll do most of the questions in one big go at the end to you and the panelists, but there is one methodological question that's come in from Mike Larkin. He says, how many students are in the survey and were they from across the whole UK?
Yes, I should have said that at the beginning. Yes, there were 2,141 applicants. They were all people who are going to go to university this year, and they're from the whole of the UK. There was some weighting as well on a couple of key demographics. It does slightly under-index international students.
Great, thank you. Mary Colonel-Cook's put a question there as well, which we might return to after we've heard from our panelists. So, and do keep the questions coming because we want this to be properly interactive. So I'm going to turn now to Nona. Nona, over to you. What do you make of the survey and what else would you like to put on the table?
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Nick. Wow, what some fascinating data there. So much information. I think really it gives universities, so just like the Advanced HEPI survey, this pre and post survey analysis provides us with a wealth of information and helps us to, I think, learn and understand the approaches that we need to take. So some of the data are really just startling for me. The 30% will start university this September with a history of missing education due to their mental health. So that means we're going to have to prepare for the possibility that 1 in 3 will have a higher learner dependency and feel less confident about other studies. So we've got to put in place those kind of mechanisms to support that. You know, 18% of applicants are with a disability say they don't plan to disclose. So in a way, we're going to be operating in the dark. So that means we have to be careful and be inclusive by design. I think that's really important for us. Trans students, we've got to make sure that we plan our social and our learning spaces to better build that sense of belonging and that safety that we saw in the survey. Applicants, less positive about their relationship, or tend to be less likely to have families to turn to, and therefore our universities have to provide them with that warm embrace through the support we provide. And turning to the kind of the Black students who start off feeling more stronger in the belief that they can make decisions. We've seen the perceptions of when value for money at the end seem to be far lower. So a lot of work to do to nourish them during their time at university. In this survey, I think it's really important, a line in the methodology states that a demographic breakdown will shine a light on where we need to go. But in some cases, only a systemic change will produce the equality of outcomes. So when I was working in EDI around the awarding gap and supporting students with disabilities, I proposed that only a three-pronged institutional approach and continuous partnership with our students would actually be effective in delivering that kind of sustained step change that we need. And I think this report emphasizes that further. So institutional processes, etc. We've got to improve the way we report, the way we design our policies. And this can range from dashboards that analyze student life cycle by demographic groups, to kind of the policies around recording gender reassignment changes on student records, the whole range of things. We've got to also enhance the knowledge and skills of our staff. So ideally, AGIs should be recruiting to a set of values. They should be seeking evidence of impact on improving the equality and quality of education. Otherwise, we'll always be retrospectively fitting or continuously embarking on these huge cultural change programs. Every academic and professional services staff must be aware of the broad challenges I think that different demographics face, and how they operationalize that. And that's the really key thing about the operationalizing. But what we're seeing from this and other surveys is that universities have to have a commitment to understanding intersectionality and individuality, so that we deal with people on an individual basis. And finally, that support for students. We've got to have better support. And in my experience, there's a temptation to focus on interventions for staff and students. And whilst this is absolutely imperative, we've got to make sure they're evidence-based, created in partnership with the students they're designed to support, and created with evaluation in mind. But this, I feel, should be the smaller segment of that pie chart, with a focus on sustainable change created via our business operation changes and the improvement in the way we support the knowledge of our staff. I want to kind of end on 2 points. So firstly, the sector. I mean, there's got to be important work we do together. Schools, FE, colleges, the NHS, other organisations, and organisations like Unite. But importantly, I think the government and the OFS really need to understand that to enable universities, who are the WP heavy lifters, to enable us to better serve our students and deliver those important government agendas such as economic and industrial growth, there's got to be a change in the approach to funding, because we're trying to be efficient, but at the end of the day, there's a diminished real cost, return in terms of the income and real values. The data is compelling. 18% of students will have missed 20 days. That's almost a month of their education. The HEPI survey showed that 4 in 10 students stated they might have chosen a different course of study or university. And I think to change numbers like this in a positive way, we've got to anticipate, create an inclusive and successful university journey. But to do this requires a fundamental shift in the way universities operate. We have to collaborate across the learning journey, and we have to look at the way in which we are funded. So I'll end there, if I may, Nick.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very wide-ranging. It raised all sorts of points I'd love to talk more about, but I'm not going to. I'm going to turn straight to Laura McInerney, who I know is at a very busy point in the year because she's appearing all over the place at conferences and on podcasts at the moment. So thank you for finding the time to do this, Laura, and over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. So we currently survey around 10,000 teachers a day, so we know a lot about what's happening in schools. And just to go on the mental health point to begin with, there's a few things that matter here from the school's perspective. Number one is, you will probably know this already, but there has been a huge increase in the waiting list for mental health services for children in schools, which may be one of the reasons why those absences are so high, simply because the services aren't available, which also means the young people, when they are coming to higher education from the autumn, may have had less help than they would have had in the past. They're less used to accessing services, and they're actually just less confident in talking about their issues. So making sure that everyone in HE is prepared for that is important. The flip side, though, is, as you've seen, those wellbeing figures are starting to creep back up. And this is, again, something we're seeing in schools. There's almost a K-shape that's starting to happen in both achievement and wellbeing, where some students got actually quite far ahead in the pandemic. Either they really thrived when they were at home, they've really appreciated the opportunity at times in their schools to be in bubbles, to be in smaller classes, to sort of sit down and do their learning, and where it's worked for them, it's worked really well. They've made really great friendships and they're kind of flying. And then there's this other group who didn't do so well in the pandemic, had much more time off, their school didn't enable them as well, and they've kind of gone on the downward incline. And so we are seeing a sort of growing gap again, both in terms of achievement and in terms of mental health. On the inclusive point, Nona, I thought that was a really good point, particularly around trans and Black students, to do with inclusive spaces and learning, but also this aspect of safety playing into it. We do know from when we do surveys of young people in schools that it's not just about the learning spaces, but a lot of times the in-between spaces. And for those students who are going away to university to live away, they're often very, very concerned about who they are going to be living with, particularly trans students who are concerned about the reactions of people. If you know, there's always a concern around bullying anyway in schools, but a concern that if you go away to university, you've got to live with people, then that can be quite challenging. And because of the fact that we can see in the data fewer people are disclosing some of these inclusion factors, it does make that harder for university to deal with, but it is something to think about. So where people live, and also travel, transport, how people get around, all of those basic things that we can sometimes forget about when focusing on learning, because that's what everyone's there for. Those tend to be the things that young people say really matter to how they feel. And finally, just to pick up, it won't matter much to most people, but there is a line in there about the fact that at least 1 in 3 young people is saying that the personal, social and economic education that they're getting at school is less than good. As someone who was a PSHE and citizenship teacher, I find that very disappointing but unsurprising. Again, schools have largely cut back on specialist teachers who in the last 5 to 8 years they would have had before that, but now budget simply won't allow. So fewer students will be getting, for example, work experience, fewer will be getting specific lessons in life skills. And it does mean that when they come to university, although they're confident in some areas, they're less confident in others. So I'm afraid the challenges that have been faced by schools, we are now handing on up to the higher education sector. Nick, back to you.
Thank you, Laura. Just while you've got the microphone, can I just put one question to you, which is, of course, we've heard in the last few days from Keir Starmer about the importance of some of these additional soft skills in schooling. There's been a big debate as to whether they're best embedded in regular school subjects or whether they're best covered separately. And it was particularly around oracy, wasn't it? Do you have a view on that?
I think we did try to embed those into the curriculum in the late 2000s, and it wasn't particularly successful, because when you've already got 500,000 teachers in a profession who are very good at teaching their subject, be that math, be that English, history, whatever, then obviously their pedagogy is often very focused on that thing, and suddenly getting them to try and jam a different subject in doesn't always work, which is why I think specialist teachers and investing in that in the future is probably what will make a difference.
Very interesting and clear. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Samantha Bronheim now, who I know as a fellow board member of the University of Manchester, and who is a great advocate for the tens of thousands of students at her university. Sam, what did you make of the report?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I thought overall really positive. Same as what the others have said. I think there's a real sense of confidence in this cohort. Really feels like we're a bit on the tail end of this kind of how the obvious effects of the pandemics, but I'm sure there's other things that are there kind of underlying that we'll need to pick out. Despite all that confidence, something that really stood out to me was a real anxiety about fitting in, which I think kind of speaks to this inclusive by design element that Nona mentioned, which is about if we want students to feel like they can fit in, we need to be encouraging inclusivity, particularly for those kind of, students with disabilities or, smaller ethnic groups and things like that. So really encouraging those communities is going to be really, really key for institutions. But we're seeing on campus huge engagement with union services and elections and welcome programs, as I'm sure many others are. So that kind of feeling prepared and wanting to be engaged and really just embed themselves in university, I think is reflected in this, which is really good. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that we want to create this sort of, this safe space, like Laura said, for students and help these individuals, warm embrace, I think is what Nona said. But I think more importantly, we also want to be empowering these students. And if we already have, this underlying confident cohort, hopefully coming in, that kind of sense of empowerment, I think is really important. So I think a big part is a sort of almost flexible aspect, whether that's flexible learning, students who have to miss class or attendance because of mental health issues, making sure that there's infrastructure in place to accommodate for that. And then I just wanted to pick out one piece on sustainability stuff. I thought the question around whether an individual's actions can impact climate change, I think that's a really important one, because as institutions, we have a lot of operational strategy and values and priorities about carbon zero and sustainability, but often that's not the stuff that students see. And I think it's just as important, if not more, for students to be able to say, yes, I went to an institution that really cares about this as much as I do, but they care that I care. So for example, they helped me find volunteering into this so that they can see that impact. And I think that empowerment piece is really important. I'm going to keep it brief just because I know we want to have lots of time for questions, if that's okay. But I'm happy to, there was another thing that was mentioned about the registering for the GP thing. I think it seems, once you get doing it, it's very easy and comfortable and a normal part of life. But as a student who's not really, or an applicant who's not really done that ever before, it's very hard to know. Safety is a big one. So what are the good ones? What are the bad ones? Other people's experiences, particularly around things like sexual identity and disability. Feeling that familiarity is really, really important. So encouraging students or guiding them into how to find a GP, how to apply, and finding somewhere that they trust is really, really important. And I know that's an issue that we see in Manchester in our advice service. That's a huge kind of area that students come in for support on.
Great, thanks, Sam, and thanks for being keeping to time, because that gives us a nice amount of time to get questions from the floor, of which we've already had some, and I've got plenty I could put to all of you as well. So let's go back to the panel, but I'm going to take, we've got 3 comments in live, and please do submit some more. I'm going to start with Mark Stowe, and Mark, if you're happy, my colleague Emma is going to turn on your microphone and allow you to verbalize, if that's a word, your own question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Can you hear me okay?
We can, and yeah. Tell us where you're from as well, Mark. What institute?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Leeds Beckett University. I'm Director of Business Engagement, Employability and Careers. Interesting report, and thanks all for your contributions. I think from my perspective, there's just a couple of things that I'd be interested in. Obviously, there's a key requirement here to look at intersectionality of our student characteristics, but also interested to explore the connections between the various themes that are within the report as well. So, for example, do we see a connection between the students who may be presenting as lacking in career confidence and connections to their well-being? So the connections between the various values. Interested in your thoughts.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Mike Larkin next, and then I'm going to go to Mary, who's got a sort of a techie question, but an important one about the data. Mike.
Can you hear me now?
We can, Mike. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, it suddenly came up behind that screen initially. I don't know why. Probably a glitch at my end. I'm just going to read it out, which Nick could have done. The survey, Jenny, shows that the sizable proportion of incoming students are not confident about their finances. It's not as big as I might have expected, but they may be optimistic at this stage of their careers. It also affects their well-being. So is there any indication about how they might plan to plug any gaps in the finance, such as part-time jobs, various other things, or more help from family and friends? Have you any indication as to why they're anxious about finances?
Thanks, Mike. And Mike writes a lot about that topic on his own website, so do look.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said I'm retired professor, 37 years teaching, and I do have a blog, Total Equality for Students.
Thanks, Mike. And you can find details on Mike's Twitter feed as well. Can we go to Mary, who Mary's got a sort of technical question, but Mary, you may have other views as well as a chair of a higher education institution and former boss at UCAS.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Good, fantastic. Thanks very much, Jenny and colleagues, for a really interesting presentation. I'm afraid I had a sort of nerdy data point, which was about the 3 in 10 missed education because of mental health. And then there was a computed number of, I think, 153,000. And I just think that's wrong, because I think you've probably taken the total of the UK applicants, rather than, I think, probably more like about 350 UK young applicants, which would make the computed number more like 100,000 or so. So sorry for the nerdy point. But while I've got the mic, I had a comment about how much we want to kind of compare everything to pre-pandemic, and the idea that we've got to get back to pre-pandemic levels for some of the engagement factors. And I just was reflecting that actually I think the pandemic, for all the kind of privations and tragedy it visited on all sorts of people, including young people particularly, I do feel that it has created permanent change in society. It's changed, for example, how people use social media. It's certainly changed the world of work very significantly, and I think has also changed for good how students learn, how teaching is delivered, and indeed what is learned. And so I have a feeling also that we need to kind of get on a trajectory of understanding what this post-pandemic societal shift looks like, and perhaps look at these data in that context, rather than saying, well, what was it like in 2019 and before? But that's just a view, but would be interested to hear what panelists think about it. Thanks.
Fascinating point. Thank you, Mary, very much. I'm going to go to Jenny first, and then I'm going to go to the panel in the reverse order. So we'll start with Sam. Jenny.
Yeah, so in terms of Mark's question, yeah, we have run a few correlations. So for example, we've looked at the impact that having done paid work has on various different things, but we haven't run all possible correlations. But we have released the full data set on our website. So if people do want to do that, that would be great. There's so much I think you could spend probably months looking at the data and running those correlations. It would be really interesting to see. In terms of Mike's question, no, we don't have any further information about how they're going to meet the financial requirements. However, we have seen that compared to last year, they are less likely to think that they're going to have enough money, and they're probably correct on that. So there is that sort of sense of realism, but going into it with a bit more confidence compared to last year. And Mary, absolutely bow to your superior knowledge in terms of UCAS data. To be honest, it was turning it into an actual number is something we did at a very late stage, and it was largely for press and PR reasons. So if I have misinterpreted the data on the UCAS website, then I'm very happy to correct that.
Thanks, Jenny. Of course, the point of producing numbers like that is to get a conversation going, and that's what we're doing, which is fantastic. So Sam, I'll go Sam, Laura, Nona.
Thanks, Nick. So to start with Mary's point around the kind of, this pre-pandemic benchmark almost, I think we're all guilty sometimes of looking at the pandemic years and almost wanting to pretend like, the disruption that was there never happened, and we're so desperate to get as far away from that as possible. I think particularly from a union's point of view, because of so much of the services that we offer are very on the ground, they're very face-to-face. Societies had to operate completely differently. Our walk-in advice service wasn't available. And that interaction is really important to building confidence and trust with students who come in with their issues. But I think you're completely right that we need to move away from that being kind of the goal and accepting that we're in a very different landscape and things are going to look very different. So I think it's really positive that certainly what we're seeing in Manchester is huge engagement beyond what pre-pandemic even looked like. And then the whole flexible element as well. So our social media, we're investing way more in that because that's how students really engage, particularly with various flexible learning programs. Students coming onto campus less means that online is really key to getting information out there, whether it's about an event that we have or policy work that we're doing. So I think it's a really, really good point and something that is very easy for us to kind of forget. In terms of Mike's question around money and being able to afford university, I mean, yeah, obviously with cost of living, I think it's no surprise that students are feeling that way. It obviously was the lowest scoring theme out of all of them. But, like Jenny said, there's clearly a sense of accepting that that's the case, and ready to go into it with the support that they do have. But I think that is likely the one that's going to change the most drastically. If you're already guessing whether you have enough money or not, it's going to be completely different to the experience you get as soon as you get to university. So I think universities need to be prepared for what financial support is already in place, how to make that more accessible. It's obviously very hard for different students. Some of the processes can be very, very intrusive for applying for financial support, but also other things such as doing free welcome weeks or removing hidden costs of university. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for more creative ways that universities can kind of help students with affordability. And then, oh, sorry, go on.
No, you finish your point, Sam. I just want to put one quick thing to you after.
I was going to move on to Mark's question. So if you wanted to jump in, that's...
Just wanted to say, have you because you and Manchester have been very successful in getting the university to give some financial support across the board. And I just wondered if you had any practical advice for other, perhaps newly elected student sabbatical officers for getting money out of their institution to stop students dropping out.
It's a really good point. Being a student officer is very fascinating because you sort of employ various different tactics and things, and you're really thrown in the deep end of what it's like to work with a huge organization, particularly one the size of Manchester. I think in some ways, this sounds weird to say, but we're very fortunate that there was a crisis. That sounds really terrible to say, but there was a real appetite for Manchester, at least, to really do something about it. And I think on the whole, we weren't seeing these sort of big, widespread cost of living packages. So for those that don't know, Manchester did a one-off payment to every single student with then additional top-ups to particular groups that were more sort of affected. And I think the problem is a lot of schemes, well, not the problem, but a lot of schemes target those most in need, which is really important. But what we were seeing with the cost of living is that there was sort of this squeezed middle of people who don't really fall into those really lower brackets, and therefore don't get the financial support that they should have. So I think a good piece of advice would be try and find ways or strategies or things that you can implement that really catch everyone or as many people as possible, because being able to target individual groups is always an option. And something that's really important to do and always going to be a priority, but being able to do something very comprehensive that helps the whole student body, I think is something that was really, really tapped into what we wanted to achieve there.
Thank you. Ed, did you meant to come in on the one other point? I think you said
just on, I think the data correlation point from Mark was a really good one. I'd be really interested to see that as well. Like I said earlier, I think we have all this confidence, and yet we have individuals who are anxious about fitting in, anxious about keeping up with the other students and things like that. So I think whilst we have this real confidence kind of on the surface, I can't help but feel like there is this undercurrent of maybe a little bit of insecurity still there, which is completely natural. So I think professional and academic development goes hand in hand with personal development that we help students through university.
Thank you. Thank you. Do keep questions coming in. I've got a list I would like to put to the panel, but it'd be even better to get them from people listening in. So do keep the questions coming in, because we will do a second round. Laura.
I'm going to defer to others on the careers and the finances, because I think lots of expertise here already touching on that. But just to come to Mary's point on about things changing for good and what that means for statistics, I think there's a really good example of what's playing out in the school system on this, which will be relevant for higher ed as well, around absence data. So for instance, we can see that absences within pupils in schools are much higher now than they were before the pandemic, but we also have to challenge whether that's necessarily a problem when, if you have an increase in people who are reporting mental health problems, are taking time to resolve mental health problems, then actually that might be a positive step. It was in fact something that we were all pushing for in the kind of mid-2010s when we were saying we need to talk about this more. So we should see that as some progress. And the other issue is just around sickness generally. We have seen more students having time off, but our data from 2018 on TeachTap, when we looked at the level of flu and Tommy bugs and everything else that people were coming into work with, and that was both the teachers and then the teachers reporting the number of ill children who were sitting in their classrooms, it was actually extraordinarily high. And so we may have to come to a new understanding of what the right level of absence is. And because of that, I agree with you. I think that when we start to think about well-being, you know, are we going to get back to 2019, or do we have to think to ourselves, is there a particular kind of number that we're aiming for? And before we started, one of the things I said to Jenny is I really like how this report has indices which look at a variety of different factors, because we all have to stay loose to the fact that over the years factors will change, and what was once seen as a really great thing, you know, everybody sitting in a classroom sneezing on each other, we might now have had a bit of a rethink.
Thank you, Laura. Nona.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on Mary's point. I actually agree completely that there is so much good that has come out of pandemic for learning and teaching. For me, I think that if I look back at the time at Solent, we used it as a complete pedagogic disruptor to really raise the standards. And that meant that thinking about course and module pages, really being inclusive by design, intently putting those requirements in place where all course teams actually had to meet certain standards, and they were audited and supported and encouraged. I think the thing about what has also changed is that students want hybrid. So they'll walk into a student hub and they'll ask for some information. They want that personal contact. They'll walk away, they'll have another one, and then they'll want to have the response in a hybrid way, and user-friendly responses as well. So it puts the impetus on universities to really think about how they are offering students a very different support system, a very different learning and teaching system. And I think that's actually quite exciting. So I do think there's a lot to be done there from universities to kind of respond to different ways that students are studying and working. And I do agree, I think it's here to stay.
Thanks, Nona. I'm going to do a second round of questions. Please don't feel you have to answer every point that's put to you, because otherwise we'll run out of time. But and I'll come to you first this time, Nona, because I know you got a little bit less time then. So can I go first to Rod Bristow, who wears a number of hats, including a Cortex HEPI partner. Rod.
Thanks, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Fascinating survey. Thank you very much to Unite for doing it. The thing that stands out for me is this greater focus on well-being. I think Laura made the point that some of the challenges in schools are being, if you like, past seeing their way into universities, although actually these COVID-induced challenges for universities around both teaching and learning and student well-being are not COVID caused, they are just sort of accentuated. So this is part of a big trend, big problems in mental health, and greater challenge with greater diversity of the student body in needs to focus on teaching and learning. The question I've got is, having done a little sort of working a little bit with, spoken to Edward Peck, the student support champion at NTU about this, is the question about what the connection might be between the two challenges, teaching and learning on the one hand and mental well-being on the other. They tend to get dealt with very separately because, of course, they tend to manifest themselves clearly separately. But on the other hand, I think there is a connection in terms of the overall experience that students have, the way in which they're engaged, particularly with the data analytics. So you can learn. So what can you learn from the learning analytics about student well-being? So I'm interested to know what the panel thinks about how well-being and learning challenges should be addressed. Are they completely separate things, or should the teaching and learning engagement experience take into account some of these additional pressures on well-being too?
Thank you, Rod. An important question. Now, I'm not quite sure whether to go for Johnny Rich or Rose Stevenson, because they're having a very interesting conversation in the chat about trans students. Let's go. I think as Rose started the conversation, I think let's see if we can turn on Rose's mic.
Hi, folks. Thanks. Thank you, Jenny, in particular for the report. It's so interesting. There's so much interesting data in there. But reading through, it seems that trans students or trans applicants are having a particularly hard time, which probably isn't a surprise to us. And I was interested in the panel's thoughts on what we can do to support trans applicants and their confidence in the application process, but also what universities can do to support the trans student experience. And see some improvements there as well.
Thank you. I've got one just come in from a new recent HEPI author, Anthony Moss, who's from London South Bank University. Anthony, and then we'll squeeze in Josh's question and then we'll go back to the panel. Anthony. Go for it, Anthony. I think someone needs to unmic you. There you are. Brilliant.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, great. Sorry, I was just chatting away to myself there for a few seconds, it seems. Yeah, thanks for that. I was just reflecting on the discussion that the panel were having about the lessons learned from the pandemic, and it was really to sort of put a more critical lens on that, which is that when you look at the OFS's access and participation data, where we'd seen a reduction in equality of outcome gaps, racialised awarding gaps, for example, we've pretty much lost all that progress. And so I wonder to what extent the sector, although we may feel that we've individually learned lots about what it is that we can do differently, I wonder to what extent we can really confidently say that we've properly embedded that, and that we've how we have we done enough to avoid just going back to old ways of doing things, because the reality is that the figures don't really support this idea that we've moved on significantly as a sector. It does appear that we've just gone back to what we were doing previously.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm fascinated by how much that question of whether we can learn from the pandemic period and make a positive out of a negative is coming up. Josh, let's quickly squeeze in your important question about sustainability, and then we'll go back to the panel for brief concluding remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Josh, Policy Manager at HEPI. I thought it was slightly counterintuitive, actually, the results on sustainability. We might imagine that students are starting to care more about the environment, not less. And so I was surprised by that. I wonder, do you think that's because students just have less interest in the environment generally? Or is it that possibly students see less role for individual action and a greater role for example, political action in responding to the pandemic?
Thank you, Josh. Until my children learn to turn off lights, I will be sceptical the young people are as committed to environmental change as they always say they are in surveys, but we will, let's see what the panel think. Nona.
Wow, a lot of questions. I'd love to spend an hour talking with people, but actually just a couple of things. So I think Rod spoke about, well, the connection between well-being, should it be in the classroom, outside, and the connection between the two. I'm going to say that as most students experience the culture of the classroom and those that are delivering, and the culture of the outside space beyond that, I think that there is needs to be better connection between professional services and learning and teaching teams. My view is that as students are my view is that wellbeing must also be delivered through the learning and teaching space as well. So for example, in the way we map out assessments, the greatest amount of anxiety for students is around hand-in dates, assessment bunching. There's a lot we can do to promote wellbeing, and a lot academic teams can be doing to ensure that statements of support needs for students are followed through. So if there are separate, we're not hitting this, the student isn't a separate person in one space than the other, that we need to connect. And I think that is a failing of universities across the board. Just want to pick up by the trans student, if I may. I always think when I learned to work with students with disabilities and learning differences, there was a slogan, and I've carried it with me ever since. If it's about me, it's with me. And trans students, that what we can do for them, they need to be involved in the co-creation of those initiatives or the answers, the strategies. I found sometimes the students inside the university may be reluctant to engage, but there's fantastic alumni on there's fantastic support groups locally, where, to be honest, I've had to go to many times to get kind of like that co-creation bit. Not all good about the pandemic, I totally agree. We did lose some ground in terms of equality. I think it's really important that Vice-Chancellors of learning and teaching and senior leadership teams are taking into account of digital poverty, the slide back of, things like completion rates for students and the awarding gap. I think you are right, we can take our foot off the pedal, but we must put pressure on the university leaders to do that. And there must be an incentive to do that. That's, I feel, really important. I'm going to hand over to my other panelists there.
Thank you. Nona, let's go to Sam next.
Yeah, Nona beat me to it. I think especially with the trans students, student-driven change in activity and being part of that conversation is really important. Just putting on events without that student voice isn't going to make them feel part of that community, even though the intention is for them. And then there's the kind of more on the ground stuff, which is residencies being, trans-only blocks, things like that, gender-neutral toilets if they're shared. And gender-neutral bathrooms on campus. And then, something that I think is overlooked, and I'm not sure how well universities do this, is easy processing for name changing during studies. A lot of students sort of might come in as trans students, or it's on their mind, and then go through that transition while they're on university. So making sure that they're supported through that process is really important. Rod's point about well-being and teaching and learning, I think, yes, absolutely, they need to be interlinked. That's too centralized and separate at the minute. I think for students, their main point of contact with the university is their academic advisor. And, it's in the name what that is for, but equally that individual should know where to signpost students, where to direct them. And it's a lot to put on those individual staff, but I think there's a middle ground where we can make academic advisors feel supported and encouraged to know how to help students who might be coming to them with well-being issues. And then just quickly on Josh's point about sustainability, yes, students definitely still care about this, but I think you're completely right. It feels almost out of our hands. It feels like we've tried, we're doing all the individual action, but nothing's really changing or no one's really listening. So people are starting to take that argument to a more national or international landscape. And I think universities and unions have a real role to play in how we help students amplify, or how we amplify their voice, or help them get to those spaces and make those cases for what is really now, you know, an international crisis. It's not just about the individual recycling, it is more than that now.
Sam, I'm sorry, the risk of going 2 minutes over, I wonder if I could just come back on you on one thing. The idea of, for example, separate blocks or corridors or whatever for trans students, and we've heard that idea for other groups of students as well. Is that actually a progressive move forward, something we should support, or is it something, because the great idea of higher education should be almost a melting pot where everybody's mixing, people from all sorts of backgrounds, you're meeting people you've never types of people you've never met before. Is it actually a backward step, even if it's necessary for people's safety?
I mean, I think that is the ideal situation, but I don't know if that is, I can't speak for the community, but I don't know if that is how it is on the ground at the minute. And I think at least having the option there is really, really important. So, you know, I do a lot of work for Jewish students as well. And something that we want to introduce is an option for kosher only blocks. It doesn't mean that we're going to delegate those rooms and have them there, because there might be no uptake, there might be no interest, but at least the option is there, the choice is there. If it does help with student safety, that doesn't mean they're going to be siloed off from other parts of the university. But, you know, living in halls is a really, really strange experience. And if some students want that to be safe and embed themselves in other ways and then have that safe space to return to, I think that's a choice that needs to be there.
Thank you. That's very clear. I'm going to go to Laura for final remarks and then back to Jenny.
I'll just pick up on sustainability to say we did a report with Pearson this year comparing on this issue, schools last year to this year. We've seen the same thing in schools. So actually there's less that's happening on sustainability. Pupils are less concerned about it and it's coming across as less important. In part, this might be to do with the fact that when there are economic and political pressures in schools, these are the kinds of things that get cut back. The recycling club is one of the first things that's going to go. You don't do as much in terms of getting recycled resources because they're more expensive if you go back to the cheaper versions. And so unfortunately, again, I think we're just going to see this as a trend over the next few years, unless there is something that kicks off that gets young people's attention again, like it did a few years ago with some of the protests.
Thank you, Laura. Very clear and very concise. Thank you. Jenny, final word to you.
Yeah, my final thought, just that the non-academic spaces and opportunities have to be just as inclusive as the academic. And I think that speaks to Rose's point, Tony's point, and something that Sam spoke very well on as well. So that's my final thought.
Well, thank you. I know we could have gone on a lot longer. I had a list of many questions I wanted to put to the panel, which we didn't get to, but both HEPI and Unite Students are committed to continuing this conversation through our daily blog, through this survey in future years. And I know Jenny is always on the lookout for interesting new aspects to add to it. So I want to end by thanking all of you for giving up an hour of your time for this important conversation, by thanking all our panelists, Laura, Sam, Nona, and Jenny, my colleagues behind the scenes, particularly Emma, who's been making sure it's all been running smoothly. We will make the recording available if your colleagues weren't able to listen in and would like to. And then finally, look out tomorrow. HEPI is publishing perhaps our biggest ever, longest ever report, marking our 20th anniversary and looking back at the last 20 years of higher education policy, including what it's like for students, regulation, funding, research. So have a look out for that and do let us know what you think of it when it comes out. Thanks again to Jenny and Unite Students for putting this really important project together, and enjoy the rest of your days. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.